The dim glow of the old desk lamp barely illuminated the room, casting long, distorted shadows against the peeling wallpaper. James Monroe sat hunched over a desk cluttered with a chaotic pile of papers, foreclosure notices, unpaid bills, and termination letters. His fingers trembled as he adjusted the edges of the documents, aligning them as though creating order from this mess could calm the storm raging inside him. The soft hum of the lamp filled the silence, heavy and suffocating, mirroring the weight of his thoughts. James leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply, his eyes wandering to the cracked mirror across the room. The fractured glass split his reflection into shards, distorting his face. He stared, unable to look away, as though the broken image spoke to the fractured trust in his own life. "Is this what I've become?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The question wasn't meant for anyone to answer. It was an accusation, a challenge to the doubts eating away at him. His fortune, built through years of tireless work, now seemed more like a cage than an achievement. The memories came unbidden, vivid, and relentless. Sleepless nights spent poring over spreadsheets, deals made on little more than faith and determination. He remembered the day he signed the contract that changed everything, the first moment he felt the intoxicating thrill of success. But with each victory, the loneliness had grown. James closed his eyes, trying to push the memories away, but they flooded his mind. The colleagues who once praised him now sought favors. Friends from his humble beginnings grew distant, intimidated by his success. And Clara, his wife, her smile had once been his refuge, her laughter a balm for his weary soul. Now he wasn't sure if her love was genuine or if it had been swallowed by the glittering life his wealth provided. A chill crept through the room, sending a shiver down his spine. James pulled his jacket tighter around him, but it wasn't the cold that unsettled him. It was the whispers of doubt. Clara's hesitant smile at the gala last month, the way her fingers lingered a little too long on the necklace he'd given her. The comment she made about never wanting to go back to their old life. "Am I imagining this?" he murmured, his brow furrowing. He clenched his fists, trying to suppress the growing tide of suspicion. His heart ached at the thought of mistrusting Clara, the woman he had vowed to spend his life with. Yet the questions refused to fade. The idea came suddenly, sharp and electrifying. James sat upright, his eyes widening as the pieces fell into place. He would test her love. If Clara truly cared for him, the person, not the bank account, then she would stay by his side even if the wealth vanished. He swallowed hard, his chest tightening at the thought. What if I'm wrong? The fear clawed at him, but so did the resolve. Slowly, he began pulling together a plan. Calls to lawyers, financial advisors, and even his closest confidant, Michael. He would fake his bankruptcy, stage a collapse so believable that even Clara couldn't doubt its authenticity. Only one way to know, James said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing within him. But as the first outlines of his plan took shape, a darker thought emerged, stopping him in his tracks. His hands froze mid-motion, and his breath caught in his throat. What if I lose her completely? James stared at the pile of papers again, his vision blurring. The weight of his insecurities bore down on him like an anchor, dragging him into the depths of despair. He whispered to himself, if I lose her love, I'll have nothing left. The silence in the room grew heavier, almost unbearable. Yet within that silence, James found a twisted sense of clarity. He stood, pushing back the chair, and walked to the cracked mirror. For a moment, he stared at the fragmented reflection. Then, as if making a silent pact with himself, he nodded. Let's see the truth, he whispered. With those words, the first step of his journey began, setting the stage for a test that would either reveal the love he yearned for or shatter his world entirely. The streets were damp with yesterday's rain, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and toil. Young James clutched his mother's hand tightly as they walked past grand houses with golden gates and manicured lawns. His clothes hung loose on his frail frame, worn and patched in too many places to count. He glanced at his mother's face, lined with worry and exhaustion, and then at the houses, so close, yet a world apart. One of the gates creaked open, and a boy about James' age stepped out, holding a bright red kite. James' eyes lit up with wonder, but he quickly looked away, embarrassed by the ache in his chest. As they walked on, his mother whispered, "Someday, James, someday you'll have more than they could ever imagine." Her words planted a seed in his heart, a promise to himself. Hunger gnawed at his belly, but it wasn't just food he longed for anymore. It was a future far from these muddy streets. Years passed, and that seed grew into a fire. As a teenager, James worked long hours at a local shop, sweeping floors and stacking boxes while his peers played games in the alley. He saved every coin he earned, tucking it away in a tin box beneath his bed. One evening, he returned home to find his father sitting in the dark, his shoulders slumped in defeat. James froze in the doorway, watching the man who had always seemed unbreakable. His father looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "I tried, James. I really tried." That moment etched itself into James' soul. He vowed never to let the weight of failure define him. As the years rolled on, James's grit and determination began to pay off. He started with small ventures, selling refurbished electronics and working odd jobs in the evenings. Each success fueled the next, and soon he found himself at the helm of a tech startup. The late nights, the missed meals, and the sacrifices finally bore fruit. His company flourished, and he became a name people respected. With wealth came admiration, but also distance. He found himself surrounded by people who smiled a little too widely and laughed at jokes that weren't funny. James stood before his office window one evening, looking out at the city skyline. The view was breathtaking, but it felt hollow. Success had come at a price, one he wasn't sure he was willing to pay. It was at a charity gala that James met Clara. She stood across the room, radiant and poised, her laughter cutting through the hum of conversations. For the first time in years, James felt a spark of something beyond ambition. They talked for hours that night, and her warmth drew him in like a moth to a flame. Clara wasn't just beautiful. She was intelligent, compassionate, and kind. She saw him, the man behind the success, or so he thought. Their relationship blossomed quickly. Clara became his confidant, his partner, his anchor in a world that often felt unstable. Yet, as the years passed, James couldn't shake a gnawing doubt that crept into the corners of his mind. He began to notice things he hadn't before, how Clara's eyes lit up when they talked about travel plans, how she lingered on the details of their luxurious life. A comment she made one evening over dinner lingered in his mind. "I'm so glad we'll never have to worry about struggling," she had said, her smile soft but distant. James's chest tightened. Was she with him because of who he was, or because of what he could provide? He hated himself for doubting her, but the thoughts refused to leave. As the doubts grew, James found himself questioning more than just Clara's love. His wealth, once a source of pride, now felt like a barrier. It insulated him from genuine human connection, making him question the motives of everyone around him. Standing in his study one night, James stared at the framed photo of their wedding day. "Am I the problem?" he murmured to the empty room. The silence didn't answer. The realization struck him suddenly, like a bolt of lightning. The only way to find the truth was to create a situation where everything but love was stripped away. If Clara truly loved him for the man he was, not the life he provided, she would stay. James knew the stakes were high, higher than anything he faced in business. But this wasn't just about money or pride. It was about knowing, once and for all, if their love was real. As he sketched out the first steps of this plan, fear crept in. He sat down, his head in his hands. What if this test backfired? What if he lost everything, including Clara? He looked back at the photo on his desk, the memory of their vows replaying in his mind. "For better or worse," he whispered. Then, with a deep breath, he steeled himself. "Let's find out," he said aloud, his voice firm despite the storm brewing in his heart. James sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the framed photo of their wedding day on the dresser. Clara's smile, radiant and full of promise, seemed almost mocking now. His mind replayed the little moments that had started to gnaw at his peace, her distant glances, her fleeting hesitation when they talked about the future, and that one evening when she laughed too easily at a stranger's remark about their lavish life. "Am I being unfair?" he murmured to himself, rubbing his temples. But the doubts refused to fade. They had taken root, each small incident adding weight until the question was no longer a whisper but a roar. Does she love me or my wealth? James stood, pacing the room. The silence pressed down on him, amplifying the war inside his heart. He wanted to trust Clara, but the fear of being used, of being nothing more than a bank account, consumed him. He felt trapped, unsure if the love he thought he had was real or an illusion. Late that night, as shadows danced across the walls of his study, James sat at his desk, surrounded by the faint hum of the city outside. His fingers drummed against the polished wood as an idea began to form, a plan so bold it made his chest tighten. "What if?" he whispered, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing in thought. "What if I strip everything away? Take the wealth out of the equation?" The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. If Clara's love was genuine, she would stay, wouldn't she? But if it wasn't? James shook his head, trying to banish the fear. He reached for his notebook and began jotting down ideas, each line sharpening the outline of his deception. Cars would disappear, properties would be sold, and layoffs would be announced. It had to be convincing. Every detail needed to be perfect. As the plan took shape, James's heart raced. "This is the only way," he said firmly, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. The next morning, James met Michael at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Michael, a rugged man with salt and pepper hair, had been with James through his leanest years. If anyone would understand, it was him. "You want to do what?" Michael's voice was low but sharp as he leaned across the table. James looked him in the eye. "I need to know, Mike. I need to know if she loves me for me. Not the money, not the lifestyle, me." Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This is dangerous, James. You're playing with fire." "I don't have a choice," James replied, his voice steady. "I can't live like this anymore." After a long pause, Michael nodded reluctantly. "All right, but promise me you'll tread carefully. This could blow up in your face." "I know," James said, gripping Michael's shoulder. "Thank you." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of calculated moves. James sold his prized sports car, replacing it with an old sedan. Memberships to exclusive clubs were canceled, and the house staff was let go, their absence leaving an eerie stillness in the once bustling estate. Phone calls to investors and lawyers were made, each one carefully rehearsed to sound as though his empire was crumbling. By the time the rumors began to spread, James's fall from grace was almost complete. One afternoon, Clara walked into the living room, her brow furrowed. "James, I just heard from Sarah. She said she saw one of our cars being towed. What's going on?" James forced a weary smile. "Just a bit of a cash flow issue, nothing to worry about." Clara hesitated, her eyes searching his face. "Are you sure?" "Positive," he replied, but his heart sank at the doubt flickering in her gaze. As the days turned into weeks, the changes became more pronounced. The grand driveway now held only the modest sedan, and whispers of James' decline reached every corner of their social circle. Invitations to events dwindled, and James noticed the subtle shift in how people treated him. Clara tried to maintain her composure, but James could see the cracks. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, she broke the silence. "Is there something you're not telling me, James? Things feel different." James set his fork down, meeting her gaze. "We've hit a rough patch, Clara. It happens." She nodded, but her fingers fidgeted with the edge of the tablecloth, betraying her unease. James began to notice troubling patterns. Clara spent more time outside the house, her explanations vague and hurried. Conversations about their future were met with deflections, and she seemed distant, her usual warmth replaced with a strained politeness. One evening, as Clara prepared to leave for yet another gathering, James asked, "Do you really have to go tonight? It's been a while since we spent an evening together." She hesitated at the door, avoiding his eyes. "It's just a small thing, James. I won't be long." As the door closed behind her, James felt a knot tighten in his chest. He couldn't tell if it was anger or heartbreak, or both. The rumors about James's financial troubles reached their peak, and even old friends began to distance themselves. When Clara returned from an outing one evening, her face was pale. "People are talking, James," she said quietly. "They're saying we're struggling." James leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Let them talk." But what if? She stopped herself, shaking her head. Never mind. James started watching Clara more closely, his heart heavy with doubt. He took mental notes of her actions, her words, her silences. Each observation was a piece of a puzzle he wasn't sure if he wanted to solve. But even as suspicion grew, a part of him still hoped. Please let me be wrong, he thought. Late at night, James sat alone in his study, the room dimly lit by a single lamp. The weight of his plan bore down on him, filling the air with a suffocating tension. He whispered into the stillness, "What if I've already lost her?" The thought lingered, heavy and unyielding, but James knew there was no turning back. The test had begun, and he was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. James sat alone in the spacious living room, the faint hum of the air conditioner the only sound breaking the silence. His hands rested on the armrest of the plush leather chair, but his mind was anything but calm. Clara's absence tonight, though not unusual, felt different. It wasn't the frequency of her outings that troubled him. It was the nagging feeling that something had shifted between them. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and stared at the empty glass of wine on the coffee table. Moments began to surface in his memory, moments that seemed insignificant at the time. Clara's distracted responses during their conversations, her habit of glancing at her phone as if waiting for a message, and the laughter that once warmed his heart now felt distant, almost rehearsed. James grabbed a notepad from the table. Hesitating for a moment, he began writing. Each observation was jotted down with precision. She didn't ask about the canceled trip. Left early for the last gathering. Took the call in the hallway, speaking softly. The list grew longer, each line a weight on his heart. The house, once filled with laughter and movement, felt eerily still. James wandered through its halls, feeling like a stranger in his own home. His footsteps echoed faintly as he passed the family photos on the walls, each one capturing a happier time. He walked into the dining room and stood by the window, watching the driveway below. Clara's car wasn't there, and he didn't know when it would return. He turned back to the table, where the remains of their untouched dinner sat. Sighing, James pulled out a chair and sat down. For years, he had been the one surrounded by admiration and applause. Now, the emptiness of the house mirrored the loneliness creeping into his soul. He reached for his phone and scrolled through photos of them together, vacations, holidays, milestones. But instead of comfort, he felt the weight of the distance growing between them. The following day, James attended a business luncheon, but something felt off. His usual circle of friends exchanged polite greetings but kept their distance. Conversations fizzled out as soon as he approached. Later that evening, Clara returned from another gathering, her laughter still fresh from the evening's camaraderie. "How was it?" James asked casually. "Oh, it was nice. Everyone sends their regards," Clara replied with a light smile. "Everyone?" James probed, his tone sharper than he intended. Clara paused, her expression neutral but her eyes briefly narrowing. "Yes, James, everyone." James nodded, but her laughter, her ease among their friends, these things felt like a painful reminder of a life he was slowly losing touch with. James' suspicions solidified one night when he opened a drawer in Clara's study and found an unfamiliar key. He held it in his hand, staring at it as if it held the answers to all his doubts. "James?" Clara's voice called from the hallway. He quickly slipped the key back into the drawer and closed it. "Here," he replied, forcing calmness into his voice. Later, he couldn't stop replaying the moment. What was the key for? Why was it hidden? His unease grew when he overheard a hushed phone call. Clara's voice was low, her tone almost pleading. The conversation ended abruptly when James entered the room. "Everything okay?" he asked, trying to mask his concern. "Yes," Clara replied, her smile forced. "Just work stuff." James nodded but didn't press further. Each discovery chipped away at the trust he thought was unshakable. The distance between them became a chasm. Clara seemed to spend more time away from home, attending gatherings and immersing herself in her social circle. James couldn't shake the feeling that she was building the world apart from him, a world he wasn't invited into. One evening, Clara returned home late. Her words were brief, her tone flat. "I'm exhausted, James. I'll see you in the morning." James wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between them, but the growing isolation left him paralyzed. The turning point came when James found a bank statement in the pile of mail Clara had left on the counter. His eyes scanned the page, his heart racing as he noticed the transfers. Large sums moving into an account he didn't recognize. He confronted her that evening. "Clara, what's this?" he asked, holding up the statement. Clara glanced at it briefly, her expression unreadable. "It's nothing, James. Just moving some funds around." "Why didn't you tell me?" James pressed, his voice rising. "I didn't think it was important," Clara replied, her tone calm but distant. James' frustration boiled over. "You didn't think it was important? How can I trust you if you hide things like this?" Clara sighed and turned away. "I'm too tired for this, James." Her dismissal cut deeper than any words could. Days later, Clara surprised James by selling her cherished designer jewelry to help cover their supposed expenses. The gesture caught him off guard. "Why would you do this?" James asked, his voice soft. "To help," Clara replied simply. "We're in this together, aren't we?" For the first time in weeks, James felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe he had been wrong to doubt her. Yet, even with this gesture, James' conflict remained. He wanted to believe Clara, but the evidence weighed heavily against her. The love he still felt for her clashed with the doubts that refused to disappear. Alone in his study, James stared at their wedding photo on his desk. "What if it's me?" he whispered. "What if I'm seeing things that aren't there?" The stillness of the night offered no answers, only the faint sound of the clock ticking, marking the passing of another moment in his battle between trust and fear. James sat parked across the street, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The glow of the street lamp illuminated the door to a building that seemed innocuous enough. Plain brick, a small sign, and a glass entrance. But what it represented crushed him. A divorce attorney's office. Through the windshield, James watched Clara step out of the building. She moved with her usual grace, her expression calm and unreadable. The sight was almost unbearable. He had hoped for some sign of guilt, a faltering step, or a hesitant glance. But Clara's composure only deepened the knife twisting in his chest. "She's already made up her mind," James whispered, his voice trembling. His doubts had been eating away at him for weeks, but this moment confirmed the worst. Clara wasn't fighting for their marriage. She was preparing to walk away. James returned home, the drive a blur of suffocating silence. As he entered the house, the walls seemed to close in on him. He sank into the armchair in the living room, his head in his hands. The room felt cavernous, filled with the echoes of memories that now seemed like lies. Every tender moment with Clara replayed in his mind, tainted by the knowledge of what he had just seen. The time she had rested her head on his shoulder after a long day. The evening spent planning vacations they never took. Each memory became a weapon against him, cutting deeper as despair and anger fought for control. "How could I have been so blind?" James muttered, his voice heavy with both guilt and rage. He thought of the test he had orchestrated, the lies he had woven to uncover the truth. And now, as the weight of his own plan bore down on him, he wondered if he had only brought about his own destruction. The house was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the floor as James sat waiting. The clock ticked relentlessly, each sound amplifying the tension in the air. When the door finally opened, Clara walked in, setting her bag down on the counter. "You're up late," she said, her tone light but distant. James stood, his movements deliberate. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm but laced with pain. Clara turned to face him, her brow furrowing. "What's wrong?" James took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I know where you were tonight, Clara." Her expression didn't change, but he saw her body tense slightly. "And where do you think I was?" she asked calmly. "Don't play games with me." James' voice cracked, his frustration boiling over. "I saw you. At the attorney's office. You're planning to leave me, aren't you?" Clara's eyes widened, but she didn't interrupt. James continued, his words tumbling out in a mix of anger and desperation. "You waited until I was at my lowest. You waited until I had nothing left. And now you're walking away." Clara stood frozen, her face pale. For a moment, she seemed as though she might deny it, but instead, her shoulders sagged. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "You think I'm leaving you?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. What else am I supposed to think? James shot back. You've been distant, secretive, transferring money to an account I didn't know about. And now this? What am I supposed to believe? Clara wiped a tear from her cheek, her voice steady despite the emotions coursing through her. James, I've been doing everything I can to save us, to save you. The words hung in the air, silencing the storm in James's mind. Clara took a deep breath and continued, her tone a mixture of hurt and determination. Yes, I went to an attorney, but not to leave you. I went to protect you. If things fell apart completely, I didn't want creditors coming after you. The money I've been moving, it's for us, James, for a safety net, so we have something to hold on to if this all came crashing down. James's heart pounded in his chest. But why didn't you tell me? Why keep this a secret? Because you've been pulling away from me for months, Clara said, her voice breaking. You've been so focused on your struggles that I didn't want to add to them. I thought I was helping. James stood there, unable to speak. Clara's words echoed in his mind, each one unraveling the story he had convinced himself was true. The betrayal he had feared was nothing but his own projection, his own insecurities manifesting into a false reality. He sank back into the chair, his head in his hands. I thought you were leaving me, he whispered. Clara knelt beside him, placing a hand on his knee. James, I love you. I've always loved you. But I can't keep fighting for us alone. You have to trust me. You have to let me in. The house was silent as James sat alone later that night, his mind racing. The anger and doubt that had consumed him for weeks were now replaced with guilt and a deep sense of shame. Clara's loyalty, her strength, her quiet determination to protect them, he had doubted it all. He looked at their wedding photo on the mantel, his fingers tracing the edge of the frame. The love in Clara's eyes, the joy in her smile, it had been real then, and it was real now. For the first time in weeks, James allowed himself to breathe. He still had Clara, and more importantly, he had the truth. James sat beside Clara on the old wooden bench in their garden, the cool evening air carrying the scent of blooming jasmine. The world around them was quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves. Their hands were entwined, but the space between them felt heavy with unspoken words. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried the weight of their shared pain and the scars left by weeks of doubt and mistrust. Finally, James turned to her, his voice low and unsteady. I don't know where to begin, he said, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of forgiveness. Clara's gaze softened, but she said nothing, giving him the space he needed to speak. I hurt you, James continued, his voice thick with emotion. I let my fears consume me, and I doubted the one person who stood by me when no one else would. You deserve better from me. His words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Clara reached up, brushing a tear from her cheek. James took a deep breath, forcing himself to continue. I don't know how I can make this right, Clara, but I want to try. I'll do whatever it takes. Clara's fingers tightened around his. James, I love you. But love isn't enough on its own. We can't build a life together without trust. Her voice was calm, but there was an undeniable firmness in her tone. If we're going to move forward, things have to change. You have to trust me, and I need to feel like we're in this together, not as opponents, but as partners. James nodded, the weight of her words settling on him. He realized that forgiveness was not a gift to be taken for granted, but something to be earned through action and understanding. In the days that followed, James began to see his life and his marriage in a new light. He had spent so many years chasing success, equating his worth with the zeros in his bank account. But sitting at the breakfast table with Clara, sharing a laugh over a silly joke, he began to understand what real wealth looked like. It wasn't the grand house or the luxury cars. It was the love they shared, the quiet moments that felt like home. Clara smiled at him from across the table, her eyes twinkling. I like seeing you like this, she said. Like what? James asked, his lips curving into a smile. Present, Clara replied. You're here, James, not lost in your head or worrying about the next deal. Just here. James reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I don't ever want to be anywhere else," he said sincerely. Inspired by Clara's strength and resilience, James invited her to join him in his business. At first, she hesitated, but he reassured her that her insight and support were what he needed to succeed, not just in business, but in life. Together, they began to rebuild not just the company but their relationship. Clara's sharp mind and compassionate approach breathed new life into the business, bringing a perspective James had never considered before. One evening, after a particularly productive day, James looked at Clara with admiration. "I should have asked you to be my partner a long time ago," he said. Clara laughed, her cheeks flushing. "I've always been your partner, James. You just didn't realize it." As the weeks turned into months, the couple often found themselves reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. Sitting by the fireplace one evening, Clara spoke softly. "You know, we almost lost everything, but maybe that's what we needed to find what truly matters." James nodded, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "Trust, love, communication. Those are the things that keep us strong. Not money, not appearances, just us." They made a promise to each other that night, a vow to never let doubt or fear come between them again. Their relationship had been tested, but they emerged stronger, united by the lessons they had learned. As the story of James and Clara's journey comes to a close, it leaves behind a message that lingers in the heart. True loyalty isn't proven through tests or trials. It's revealed in the quiet moments, the sacrifices, and the unwavering support shared between two people. Their story is a reminder that trust, love, and resilience can overcome even the deepest doubts. And for those watching, it's an invitation to reflect on their own relationships, to cherish the connections that make life meaningful, and to find strength in the challenges that test their bonds. The story you've just experienced isn't just about James and Clara. It's about all of us. Relationships are built on trust, nurtured through love, and tested by the challenges life throws our way. Their journey reminds us that the struggles we face, whether big or small, can reveal not only the strength of our bonds, but also the courage it takes to repair and rebuild. Now, take a moment to reflect on your own story. Have you ever faced moments of doubt or challenges in your relationships? How did you overcome them? Share your thoughts and personal journeys in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else who's looking for hope. We also want to hear how you found your way through life's hurdles. Did a conversation, a gesture, or a moment of clarity help you move forward? Let us know in the comments. Your insight could be the light someone else needs to find their path. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life tales of resilience and love. These stories remind us that no matter how tough the road gets, we are never truly alone. And don't keep this inspiration to yourself. Share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Together, let's create a community where shared experiences become lessons and lessons become hope for the future. Thank you for watching.